Good evening. This is Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to our Monday LaRouche PAC Strategic Overview with Michael Stager. And today is April 24th. So thank you all for joining us this evening. I know that there is a lot on people's minds. We'll get started here in discussing the question of some of the latest developments and what's going on, but also how the LaRouche Political Action Committee is taking a leading stance on organizing the population to understand what it's going to take to achieve victory. First thing, I know that there are probably a lot of you questioning and looking at what just happened with the announcement that Tucker Carlson has left or been fired from Fox Nation. Fox Nation, we know, has lost a lot of subscribers. Still, the details in terms of what has happened with that are not clear. What we do know is, like President Donald Trump, Tucker Carlson has stood firmly against the deep state globalist cabal and has went against the censorship policies and has continued to put a focus on what's happening to the attacks on our nation, on the American people. And as most people are talking about, they canceled their Fox Nation subscriptions and want to follow Tucker Carlson and so forth. But the real issue at hand is we have to shut down this deep state globalist cabal who thinks that it can get away with censoring anybody who does not act on its behalf or does not follow in its footsteps. And so this is why what President Trump is continuing to do and what the American people have to understand about the fight for making America great again, the fight to put an end to this globalist system is something that President Trump has kept front and center. And in doing so, he's not just laying out what the problems are and what the attacks are on the American people, as he's facing those same attacks of the weaponization by the weaponized justice system that wants to put him away for good, or the attacks coming against our economy and the American people. But what he's continuing to outline is a solution through a programmatic approach. And what LaRouche PAC has committed to is actually filling out and defining this programmatic approach to what President Trump has called his Agenda 47 program, and why this is so important. I'm going to pull up here quickly our website because I want to make sure everyone is following. Just 1 second here. Oh, sorry about that. Hit the wrong button. Okay. What LaRouche PAC is involved in, as many of you know, we have continued to emphasize our new program and campaign to build a nation with Trump's Agenda 47. And I would encourage each and every person on here, if you're new, if you're on this discussion live tonight, if you're watching the discussion when it's posted on YouTube after the recording or the recording, study this page, take it out with you. We're having a fabulous impact across the country with our mobilization. Starting up, there are new MAGA groups, Make America Great Again groups, working to help to define President Trump's policies. There are various discussions that are happening. But so what you will find here is not only do we feature a number of the short clips that he has put out in his website and page with Agenda 47, but we also feature some subsequent and actual material that helps to develop that, including, if you haven't watched it, there are a number, first of all, in the last couple of weeks, Susan Kokenda, one of our associates, and Brian Lance also have been doing some very important interviews discussing questions that President Trump is bringing up. What does it take to build new freedom cities? How are we going to get those freedom cities going again? What are the material resources that are needed to do that? Also, why is it that freedom cities or cities in general, the building of new cities has stopped? When did that stop? And some of the history behind that. And so what Brian laid out in his recent presentation with the last interview that he did with Susan is really telling from the standpoint of most people don't even know about the level of mineral resources that we have in the United States. Ask the question of why are we getting uranium from other countries when we have it right here? So there is a lot that you can learn and a lot of knowledge from this program. It goes in conjunction with and directly hand in hand with our campaigns for abolishing the Federal Reserve and the Prometheus Project for expanding thousands of new nuclear power plants, for developing a leap in energy development. People talk about how we were energy independent and now, we're not anymore. How can we do that again? Not just developing fossil fuels, which is very important, and natural gas. Shutting down the green environmentalist agenda is an absolute must, but developing resources around nuclear fission and advancing to fusion. So I was listening to a discussion on yesterday, and by the way, this weekend, Ways and Means Committee held a hearing on the economic impact on small businesses under the Biden administration. Everybody on this call is probably suffering from the Biden economic impact. How are we going to reverse that trend? And that requires a deeper understanding how we think in this time of crisis and how we pull ourselves out of this crisis. So let me stop the share there. I encourage you again, visit our website at larouchepac.com, look at that page and discuss more of the, and study the material that's there. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael now to take us further into what we are faced with today in terms of not just thinking about all of the problems that we're confronting, but thinking about why it is that President Trump just recently in Tennessee with donors at the Republican RNC convention and Republican leaders laid out that the Republican Party, again, as he has continued to stress, is no longer the party of suits and ties and the good old boy operation, that this is the party of the working class. This is the party of the forgotten men and women. And this is what more people are responding to. And that is why when you see something like a representation similar coming forth in terms of even Democrats wanting to break with the insane Biden agenda, as we're watching the emergence of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. come forth in the Democrat Party, this should open up some very interesting discussion and debate as to what this means and how it's going to affect the overall upcoming election process. And I know Michael will be able to respond to that a little bit more. So again, Trump declares a new GOP, new Republican Party, while the Biden is recycling the imperial policies. And we see this, Rupert Murdoch and Fox News and everything else, who thinks that they can get away with firing Tucker or the continued attacks on our republic, is not going to be accepted any longer by the American people. So with that, let me go ahead and turn it over to Michael and have him respond to some of that and give his opening remarks.
Great, thanks, Keisha. Welcome. if this is your first time joining us, we appreciate having you. The discussion tonight will be, I have a certain idea I want to get at, but let's just take up what this Tucker Carlson firing represents, because it in some ways sets the stage, or is an indication. You might say it's the prelude, like the opening of Henry V chorus, where you're given a clear indication that at this point, the crime Tucker committed, and they try to make it seem as if Tucker despises President Trump. He said F Trump in a text to Laura Ingraham or something back in 2020 or whatever it was, which was a pretty emotionally difficult period for many Americans. But he just did an outstanding interview with Trump, where Trump had perhaps an ability, unlike even other people at Fox like Hannity or Mark Levin, to really provide a quality of his own thinking on the questions of war and peace, the existential questions. And Fox's decision, more than anything, is an indication that they've got to tighten up the ship. Biden is supposed to announce for president tomorrow, and it is all in on trying to maintain what you could say, in a certain parlance, this is a counter-revolutionary move by the people, the globalists in power. That what Trump represented in 2016, what MAGA represents, what America First represents, what the new Republican Party of the working class represents, is an American revolutionary reflex. And what Tucker reflected when he came on and joined Fox in their late night program after Trump got elected, and was the leading voice dismantling the Russiagate hoax on major news, that Tucker reflected that kind of patriotic commitment to truth. And that has to be shut down. And what you see is a paradigm of massive censorship. Now, this starts some time ago. I mean, it became, this is where Jordan Peterson became somewhat famous. They wanted to mandate what pronouns you used, mandating certain kinds of speech. But we saw this with the deplatforming of Trump. It was part of the coup in 2020. It was part of the J6 operation. It was part of the Hunter Biden laptop story, which has, of course, gotten a lot of traction recently. So we'll have to see what happens there. In some cases, you see a certain potential from the enemy to throw Biden under the bus. Mike Morell is a leading top globalist operative, former acting head of the CIA, total war hawk, total British kind of fop in his political orientation. He's not an American patriot of any respect. And this is the guy that's saying the Biden team, Anthony Blinken personally, who was then a senior advisor to the campaign, called up Morell and said, we need a letter basically saying the Hunter Biden laptop is really Russian disinformation. And then the media went with it. We saw it from Twitter. We know Twitter was just an arm of the intelligence agencies. So this censorship regime is building. The European Union has done a massive censorship and behavioral control agenda. It's been ongoing, but since COVID, it is ramped up to a massive level. Most Americans have no idea. We see some protests in France or the Dutch farmers, but it's a real control process. Perhaps the leading case in the world today for this kind of complete government control of social media, online material, is in Brazil. The country that's supposed to be leading the de-dollarization away from the dollar, moving towards China. China's the Great Rescue, also wants to implement a complete thought and censorship control on the population in terms of alternative media voices. And as people have said, in Brazil, there is no Fox News down there. So they don't even have that kind of conservative cable voice, which, as we know, Rupert Murdoch is an Australian British oligarch who has no patriotic reflex towards the American people. And that's why they didn't want Tucker Carlson or anyone representing that view, a view of peace, the view of peace, the leading view of peace in the country on Fox News. We all were struck by the irony of that while Tucker remained on Fox. So this question of censorship, of control of speech, has created a whole different layer of discussion in this country. And it's important. And it has a number of layers. A few of the immediate ones, people heard about Matt Taibbi, that an IRS agent went to his house the same day he was testifying to the government weaponization of government committee by Jim Jordan. Democrats on that panel are now calling for Taibbi to be indicted for lying to Congress, when it was already been demonstrated by fellow journalists Taibbi didn't lie. MSNBC did, but they're calling for him to be arrested and indicted after they already threatened to basically, audit him for the last 7 years, which probably includes a lot of legal fees, certainly accounting and financial fees. But that's, of course, one egregious case. There's a case that Tucker Carlson touched on last Thursday that Glenn Greenwald has been reporting. Glenn has also been reporting on the whole Brazil situation. But there's a one in Florida where there's a number of Americans. They happen to be Black socialist political activists who are against Biden. They're also Black Lives Matter type supporters, but they're wholly against the Ukraine war. They think that it's absolutely wrong, immoral, criminal, and so on. And they've held that view. Now, they've been caught up probably in some various intelligence operations, but they've ultimately done nothing criminal except voice an opinion against what the current regime is saying has to be the accepted line. And on the question of war, and on the question of an existential war, a world war, a potential nuclear war, which Trump just recently addressed on Tucker Carlson in an extensive interview, where at that point, Tucker hadn't had Trump on for a while and was largely been promoting DeSantis just to make some of these things kind of more obvious. But DeSantis has been obviously exposed. He's a war hawk. He's also just getting crushed by Trump. That if you're going to criminalize opposing a regime of war, as we are with the policy in Ukraine today, you're looking at a real threat to the United States constitutional republic and the very fabric of civilization. And it's clear that if China has an extreme degree of censorship, if the EU is going there, if Brazil is going there, then the last potential bastion for the importance of this principle is a major part of what's taking place today. Now, it's worth pointing out, because it's part of the strategic dynamic, the Ukraine war is just a total catastrophe, as some of these intelligence leaks. That's another example of a young kid, National Guard unit, releases a bunch of documents, probably wasn't just him, on the Ukraine war, but it just shows the level of devastation. It's a meat grinder, 300,000 casualties, potentially 150,000 deaths on the Ukraine side, probably 30 to 40,000 casualties only on the Russian side. I mean, that's still massive. That's practically the casualties. If it is around 40,000 for the Russians, it's hard to say. We had 50,000 dead in Vietnam. We probably had and hundreds of thousands of casualties. But it's certainly far more extensive than anything in Iraq or Afghanistan that we've encountered. So, but the Ukraine is in no way, shape, or form able to do a major offensive. That regime is collapsing. And I think most of, and there's ways of kind of verifying or documenting that, but the massive stronghold of Bakhmut, the town in Ukraine, in the Donetsk region, which has now been, ceded to Russia. This was their massive fortified point of defense, of logistics, and it's been lost. And there's probably no major defensive position that Ukrainians will hold similar to this for the rest of the conflict. We'll have to see, but that's what it looks like. So this is a complete failure within the course of less than a year and a half, a complete failure of U.S. foreign policy. Everything they said about Ukraine, that we were going to sanction Russia, it would be done, it would be over with, everything will be normal, that we didn't blow up the pipeline, maybe that was Russia. It was, of course, the Biden regime, the pipeline into Germany. Germany is in total collapse and political chaos. They're governed by these psychotic, practically Nazi Green Party, shutting down both the production and industry and going to war with Russia. Everything we've said about this war has been a complete lie. And yet a few people, activists in Florida, oppose it. And now it's a question of having to criminalize them and make them an example. So the stakes are, of course, very, very high. And a lot of the American people, a growing number, whether they're watching Musk or Tucker on Twitter, watching the various people who have participated in this political fight, are increasingly becoming aware there is a real threat and danger here. And their response is to say we should defend free speech. Misinformation is free speech. Speech that people don't like is part of free speech. And oftentimes you hear this, I think it goes back to maybe, was it Justice Brandeis or someone in the Supreme Court who said the response to bad speech should be more speech, should be good speech. And that is certainly true. And censorship, this woke ideological program, which is justifying censorship, it's giving some type of this facade of idealism that there's a cause, that Budweiser had a cause for putting a transvestite on a beer can, that Fox has a cause to get rid of Tucker Carlson, to defend democracy and against the J6 terrorists or something. There's some idealism of democracy they're defending. That was the same thing you saw in every ideological insanity, from the French Revolution, the Nazi regime, the Soviets, you name it. There's an idealism that justifies that level of totalitarian control. And of course, they go after free speech. This is, it's to me, it's still a bit of an enigma. Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s candidacy. His economic policies are probably atrocious. And he hasn't really said a lot. He's been very fixated on the vaccine and COVID. And he's right about that, but that's in the past. What are his plans for the future? And if people have questions on that, we can discuss that tonight, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But he did, of course, address the censorship question. But I want to address it from a different angle. And in some ways, I think it addresses why we have these discussions. As many of you who get on frequently know, we're not a news show. We're not going through a lot of the news of the day. We touch on it. It's part of a strategic update. We're not necessarily trying to lay out point by point what you need to go and do this week, today, tomorrow. We try to provide that when we think it's clear and direct. And a lot of times it comes out of our discussion. People are putting forward ideas and we get a sense of, okay, how do we go about implementing our ideas, our thoughts, our discussion into the world? But the very core of these calls really is based on the method that LaRouche was really insistent upon. That what has been censored more than the ability to speak freely, and of course, speaking freely, if anyone, and I'm sure everyone, has been in some kind of meeting, business meeting, whatever, group meeting, where people all say the politically correct thing. And then you sit there, you all say the politically correct thing, you get up and you leave, and nothing changes, nothing gets done, because everyone's just parroting what they think they should say. No one really said what they really thought about the situation in the business or the group or the political activity you were doing. And so if no one said what they really thought, the meeting had no impact on anything, and probably drove people further, more cynical. That's what censorship does. It drives a cynicism. You can only have a real political discussion. You can only discuss and have a viable self-governing republic if people can say what they really think, even if that's incredibly angry or outrageous or offensive. It's important for people to say what's on their heart, mind, and soul. And many people will defend it from that standpoint, and that truth has to be defended from that standpoint. And it absolutely does. It absolutely does. But as I was describing why we have these discussions, is that what has been overlooked has been the ability to discuss, it can be sometimes direct. And I think, like, if you listen to our Saturday night classes with Tony Pappert on Saturday, or on other of our Saturday night courses, you find that we discuss it almost directly, but the quality of thinking. Human thought is not an obvious question. Most of the human senses, how the ears work, is actually not obvious. We think it's, if you hear something, how eyes and vision work. As we came to find out in the recent 150 years, there are multiple wavelengths of light, spectrums, infrared and ultraviolet, to name two others, versus visible, radio, X-ray, that the spectrum is different, and that there are aspects to the physical universe that, though we might have thought were just obvious, we see with our eyes. We came to realize there was much more to vision as a field of opportunity than just human vision or our eyesight or visible light. And it became an investigation. And we have all kinds of new technologies because of that. Well, the same is true with human thought. The one person that has been part of the canon of our civilization for the last 2,500 years has been Plato, of which all of his writings are dialogues investigating how people think in real time in the dialogue, and recognizing that for any person's hypothesis, whether it's an incredibly elevated scientific hypothesis, as Susan Kokinda discussed in one of her recent discussions on the Theaetetus, one of Plato's great scientific dialogues, or if it's with, slave-owning numbskulls like Meno in the Meno dialogue. The point is that there's always a quality of improving through a quality of discourse, through organizing, through discussion, through a deliberation of ideas. Not, we know what we got to do, we got to go do it. Well, wait, do we know what we got to go do in a circumstance of which no one has ever seen before? No one of us has ever faced such a historical moment like this within our own country, certainly not in our own lives. And it's never really been experienced by anyone else. There may be comparisons or parallels, but it's not the same. So why do we assume we know exactly what we need to do? And that, to a large extent, the question of thinking, of dialogue, of discussion has been taken out of the cultural vernacular of our nation. If you compare just Plato and Aristotle's works, if you just read some of Aristotle and read a Plato dialogue, if you've never done this, it's incredibly valuable to do so. You'll find that Aristotle acts like he knows everything. And he writes it like, here's what we know. I know everything. Let me tell you what I know. Now, it's an impressive at some level for an ancient culture, but it's not universal. Some of the questions he might raise are analytically useful, but the method Plato uses is culturally universal to every culture on our planet. It is the very bedrock of scientific thought, philosophical and political thought, even the questions of the immortal soul. Now, there's a great American writer who recognized that the kind of censorship we see today may be an extreme in American culture, though Woodrow Wilson and the Supreme Court at that time criminalized opposition to World War I. So this question of free speech, especially in times of war, is not something new. But Edgar Allan Poe recognized that there's another degree of censorship, that it's where a culture gets built up that by the way the culture is shaped over multiple generations. Poe is writing in like the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. That the way the culture is set up starts to deprive people of an ability to evaluate their quality of thinking, to have discussions that go beyond the immediate practical. Even though the questions are of the greatest importance and significance, we just simply respond to the news cycle. We respond to the reactionary issues of transgender swimmers or whatever else is thrown into the media mix. And we don't end up with any cultural institutions fighting for that opportunity, that space, that isn't simply a worship of God, but is a participation in a dialogue of creation, which is really the bedrock of a political republic. The Latin farmer, right? It's not just that he reads a lot of books. It's that here's a farmer that someone from Europe would encounter, and this happened repeatedly from various different people, and they would find from Germany, from France, and they would find that the average farmer would be able to engage with them in a discourse about the world. What are we doing? How do we shape government? How does a real government function? That there was a quality of thinking involved in an evaluation of that thinking. So this writer, Edgar Allan Poe, you probably have all heard of him, great poems like The Raven and other great short stories. He did one story called The Purloined Letter. And he got at this kind of censorship of culture itself. Not just of that you can or cannot say certain things, but that you basically are prevented from the ability to think. And it was called The Case of the Purloined Letter. In a very quick summary, a letter is found to be essential, critical. And so a number of the investigators for the police department want to find the letter. So knowing that the police department, in this case, he has the person has a sense of the profile, realizes that the best place to hide the letter will be in broad daylight, on top of the mantle, right? Like the cornerstone of the entire room. Like no one could not see that. So when they come in, they look everywhere. They pull apart the entire table. They pull apart the table legs. They pull apart the legs of the chairs. They look in every nook and possible cranny to find that letter, because it's got to be hidden somewhere that's not obvious. And this is what is happening with Trump's Agenda 47. Trump is putting this out in broad daylight. It's clearly there. But the American people, even the strongest supporters of MAGA, are not seeing this. They don't see the potential of it. They're caught reacting to the news. It's if they've been dragged out of Plato's cave, they're now in broad daylight, but they still don't have the bearings to see the real difference between inside the cave and outside. That Trump is putting forward a visionary perspective that's not partisan. Now, many of you know this, we've stressed it, Keisha stressed it now, and we have, as she said, we have a great interview with Brian Lance and Susan Kokinda on our website, and we're going to do a series of these, including the building of 10 freedom cities. We just launched last week the largest rocket ever built by mankind. This will fundamentally change our ability to continue to advance human civilization. It's a great success. Against all the cultural odds, we made great success. And what Trump is doing is even more profound than anything SpaceX is doing. Trump is trying to build this out for an entire national cultural commitment towards, again, thinking about building new cities. How many state legislatures in the Western states especially, what they have, might have Republican majorities, big MAGA pro-Trump states like Wyoming. Are they having discussions of where to build new cities? Maybe, but we should make sure they are. And the point of this question of thought, of thinking, of the cultural censorship that prevents something you didn't even know was happening. That's where it starts. And then it ultimately comes to the point of the overt, forceful censorship that you now see happening today. But to revive a real sense of free speech, it's to revive a sense of thinking. And that's what we're asking you to do every day. We're asking you to engage in those discussions in the grocery stores when someone says, I like your MAGA hat, or on the street corner, or with neighbors. I mean, obviously, these are people that you either get to know or can have discussions with. It's not always easy. Maybe it's inviting them over for a cup of coffee, or sitting down somewhere and talking, setting up an appointment to talk. But it's just to discuss and say, look, we clearly have been doing something wrong if we're discussing the chemical castration of children. Okay, so we're against that. How did we get here? What happened? What do you think about it? And if we can get beyond the political correctness, if people can begin to say what they really think, they feel that they're not going to be judged, then once you have that quality of discussion, it is an intrinsic natural tendency, if there's a sincere interest in solving problems, to start hypothesizing, to start maybe thinking about thinking differently. And that's really the criminal nature of this censorship regime. But it's not just the regime, it's the entire cultural outlook for 50, 60 years. It's oftentimes called American pragmatism. You know, we know what to do. We know how to get it done. Get her done, Jim. I mean, that's an important go get productive environment that the American people have. We all, we get things done in this country. That's a good thing. But you can't be practical or assume we know what to do, or assume that just because we politically disagree, that there aren't things that we can discuss about how we're thinking as a people. And that really is the question. Because what we have over this coming few weeks and months ahead of us, especially as Trump eliminates this old Republican Party, the DeSantis, Bush, Paul Ryan crowd, the Fox News crowd, which is going to be even easier to now dismantle, is that he'll have an increasing ability to speak to the nation as a whole, not to the Republican primary. He shouldn't even debate these clowns. He can speak to the American people. And we want to be out there engaging with an increasing number of people in about how we're going to build this future, about how we're going to provoke a different quality of thinking within young people. Young people are craving, for an honest 16, 17, 18-year-old, they're thinking to themselves, whether they know it or not, and they probably don't know it yet, but they're thinking it. There's got to be a different way of thinking about our society than the way we do right now. There has to be a different way of approaching human society than the way we assume the way we've been doing it for decades. And nothing can be more inspiring for younger generations to see that kind of thinking reflected in a presidential campaign with real visionary policies. And this is really the broader task. This is the task that Lyndon LaRouche set up over 60 years ago, or about 60 years ago. And it's something that is really an American tradition. It's how Abraham Lincoln approached life in general. When you look at Abraham Lincoln's life, it was filled with constant philosophical questions, constantly challenging a way of thinking, himself and others. It's really what makes us Americans. We don't sit and go, our tradition is, the way we do things is. We change. We love changing and advancing and developing. And we find that we can grow just as a natural occurrence because we're not stuck in the old ways of doing things. And that's really why we try to have these discussions. We want your thoughts unfettered, without any political correctness, without any filters. And we want to try to have that quality of discussion that allows us to go out each week and bring that quality of at least hypothesis. It's never easy to challenge how people think. If you do that, you're usually kicked out of the room. You know, that's the old fable. But nonetheless, we know that that's what our nation has to do today, that the stakes could never be higher, and that the opportunity, given the confluence of different aspects, especially of Trump's campaign and his courage to keep fighting, make the opportunity critical. In a few months' time, the presidential campaigns will become increasingly partisan. You know, Trump versus Biden or Trump versus whoever. We'll see how long Biden lasts. But the ability for us to provoke this kind of discussion around something like Agenda 47 that challenges everything about how we've been doing things for the last many decades, it really gives us an opportunity to go be aggressive in what is otherwise it can be a very scary moment. So that's my thoughts tonight, my orientation. Keisha, I'll hand it back to you and see what people are thinking.